Hello, and welcome to Eloqua Office Hours, our monthly session covering marketing automation insights and solutions. Your questions drive office hours, so we appreciate those who submitted questions before today's session. After we end, we'd appreciate your feedback through a brief survey to help us improve future sessions. This session is being recorded, and you'll receive the replay link via email tomorrow. We have a special offer to share at the end of today's session, so be sure to stick around. Now let's get started. I'm Sebastian Martinez, Account Director at Fourth Art Marketing. Today, we are fortunate to host a very special guest, Matthew Ryno, who will be interviewed by Richard Holder, our Director of Marketing. Matt is the ABM and Marketing Ops Lead at Brady Corporation. With extensive Salesforce experience, he is well versed in relaying data to sales teams through various marketing automation platforms. As a four-time Marketo certified expert, now managing a robust Oracle Eloqua integration, Matt offers a unique perspective on using Oracle Eloqua and the increasing integration capabilities required in today's multi-platform environment. He will be discussing Brady's federated multi-brand Eloqua global implementation, some unique integrations and capabilities made possible through the Eloqua API, and the inclusion of cloud apps from Forethought in essential evergreen workflows. Before I turn the time over to Richard, just a few more items. If you have any questions during today's presentation, and we hope that you do, please use the Q&A feature so we can keep everything organized. Feel free to ask questions about today's topics or suggest topics for future sessions. And with that introduction, let me turn the time over to Richard and Matthew. Richard, you're on mute.
Hello.
I hate it when that happens. All right. So
First day.
thank you, Matt, for joining us today. Today's presentation will be a combination of discussion. I've got some questions for Matt. He also has prepared some slides on a few topics that he wants to give some emphasis to. So we're looking forward to seeing those. So let me start out with my first question for you, Matt.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your role at Brady?
Sure. So in my role here, I manage the account-based marketing. So we're looking at target different accounts that might have propensity to buy our products and getting sales involved at just about the right time. So in order to do that, that requires a lot of data and tracking, which is what we can use Eloqua for. Also run the marketing automation and operations here of everything else. So it's a lot of different types of campaigns and initiatives that our teams or sales teams or partners want to run. So it's a really exciting role to be in with a lot going on. Yeah.
Great. And for those who aren't familiar with Brady, could you just give us a big picture of who you are?
Sure. Brady provides a lot of safety solutions for the workplace. I think if you're in an industry and you're looking to keep yourself safe and protected, we offer a number of things, whether it's making sure the electrical systems are safe for somebody working and doing maintenance on a machine, or if it's somebody operating a forklift, or maybe constructors of a data center need to safely construct that, or maybe an IT person who labels, cords and different elements that are connected in that data center. So we've kind of expanded to be, a solution for many different elements of, our day-to-day life. So.
Great. How did you get started in marketing operations? I know everyone seems to have a unique journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story is you don't necessarily have to come in and have a technology background and or study computer science or something, as we all know. In fact, my journey came, starting off my career as a journalist. So I found my way into marketing in time and found my way into that, because I love investigation, kind of figuring out problems, uncovering, possible solutions. And, so you kind of realize in your career, if you're able to communicate well and, build out arguments, prove them out. It serves you well. So I think marketing operations is constantly you're doing detective work, even in some of our ABM strategies that we're going after accounts. So you're constantly finding a need for something, finding a solution, testing out theories. My hobby in the back here you see is astronomy. I do astrophotography, so I very much love the technical components of our job that we do, and it's fun to really dig into data and make some operations work. Like maybe like a formative example would be coming into marketing and realizing the power of being able to project manage with the engineering team to literally make I think at that time it was make a instruction and kind of resource center a part of a product and build that out. And so that really pulled upon the coding to be able to investigate, solve that, but as well as the communication to build a case for that and prove it with analytics of how this can really improve our progression. And that was back at a time when the company I was working for at the time was just starting to investigate Marketo at the time and understand how a nurture journey could be built out. And really people getting people connected based on what their product is to, further instruction as they become a more mature customer is instrumental. So being able to weave those two together was really formative to me, and that's always stuck with me.
Great. And so you started with Marketo, and then when you joined Brady, I'm going to skip anything in between. You're now thrust
I'm here
into
now.
the Eloqua world.
Yeah.
What was your first impression after you got to see Eloqua and use it a bit?
I prepared a couple of slides for that even because it was an interesting, and you proposed that question to me, it was an interesting thought experiment. So I'd just be driving and, something would just pop in my mind. Oh yeah, that. I don't have to do that anymore. I wish I had a graphic that I didn't make one in time, but that would show a smart campaign blowing up because that's essentially what it's like. No longer do you have light bulbs that you have to work with. So if you have one takeaway, you don't have to work in light bulbs. But really coming into Eloqua, it's some things that I'm happy not to be seeing from Marketo is the idea of your sync errors. So it's good and it's two-way integration. But if you have a problem trying to go into that activity, notorious activity log, and troubleshoot it was never fun. Likewise, campaign queue and the teams I worked with was always a source of trouble. Not realizing, something is stuck, it's got higher priority, what's going on. So I'm glad to not have to look at the campaign queue again. And again, no more looking at your light bulbs. Just often a thing that would get teams I'd see all the time was, the amount of people going through a smart campaign and the limit on the smart campaign and realizing, oh no, you got to raise that for it to run. So it's just all the little quirks with campaigns that I think are different when you're managing more of Eloqua's built as an enterprise marketing system, and it really shows once you're able to work in that. I think it kind of just wanted to show pros rather than knocking each because we come into the role we have to adapt to either one and we make it work. So there's always going to be cons that you'll encounter in either one, but I think the biggest potential that you can realize in Eloqua is custom object data, the combinations between account contact and custom object. It's more three-dimensional, which for me is more of a visual person. I find the visual strength, the visual flow strength to really be a plus. So if we go back to the smart campaigns, it puts you less in the linear thinking and having to daisy chain things in order in a in these smart campaigns that, yeah, you have to go back to check what was in there, in what order, because everything will run down the line and then it will go to another smart campaign. So being able to visually call out and, enter and exit into programming route data is a huge strength in Eloqua. Really feeds into that evergreen qualification. So you can always have data flowing constantly, and you know where it's going because you can visually track it, see it on that canvas, and flow it through, which opens up so much creative potential for adding on bolt-on integrations. I mean, engaging what we can here with even forethought to add on in those certain decision points and flows, right? Or being able to cut outside through Eloqua's ability to post in the API to another system. So it doesn't keep you as embedded in Marketo system. Likewise, though, I mean, if you're watching this or watching the recording later on, you're going, "Hey, I like Marketo." There are a lot of advantages. I think the nurture system, the graphic interface of that nurture system and Eloqua is not something you see in other tools, and it's got a lot of potential with the streams and the ways that you can shift in and out of nurture streams, which is remarkable if you're able to use that and you have a team geared up to use that. Lead scoring, it is a tool that's built to be deployed kind of quicker. So it's easier to start that lead scoring system from the ground up if you're inheriting a team or have to redo a lead system by working in the lead scoring system. I find email authoring lander builders. I think I'm probably getting into a little controversial territory here with some users, but honestly, the UX, the user experience is a lot more modern, which bodes well for quickly being able to onboard, have team members to build out emails and see the results of a lander that's easily to drag and drop. So it's really geared for that quick deployment. I mean, velocity is another thing that is unique that some people see as a strength too with Marketo. So the other thing I think too is just once you're in Eloqua, if you have to spot pivot anything, it's an enterprise system, so it's revolved around this concept that you'd had to plan out your operation from a while back, and you would have had this all mapped out in your mind so that that visual canvas is ready to go with the five or six things that you're going to weave together. It's pre-built, whereas in Marketo it gives you a lot more, spot capability. Found sometimes it's just set up that smart campaign really quick to, resync this group of contacts that wound up in this specific scenario a lot faster. And I think if you ask me if we go into the future with Eloqua, one of the things I like to see with Eloqua, we get more into the CRM sync conversation, but the fact that we have this Marketo tool that's built with Salesforce as a, really instrumental component to the sync and the bidirectional sync is important. That being said, Eloqua's advantage is also in its sync when it's used correctly, in that you have so many options in Eloqua to not just talk about one contact or lead sync or, a simple in the context of the bidirectional setup, but you can custom set up those different objects for different projects and deployments and whatever that your dispersed teams might be getting into in Salesforce. So that's another advantage to Eloqua side, and I, I hope to see. I mean, that's being improved in the future as Eloqua kind of looks at its Salesforce connection module.
That's great. Great. Yeah, I can see we do both Eloqua and Marketo here at Forethought Marketing, and we definitely have advocates on both sides. But at the end of the day, it's you use the tool that you have in front of you, and you take advantage of the capabilities there.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, let me move on to my next question here. And it's kind of tied to, because I wanted to hear from someone who had moved from Marketo to Eloqua. Um, when you got to Brady, where did you see opportunities to improve what they had done in the past?
Well, that's a good question because whenever you're going to a new place, you're going to see all kinds of opportunities. I think having the tool deployed in the way it was good to see that the teams had, from the beginning, worked with Salesforce devs to build out that tool. So I was lucky by walking into a situation where, this was many, many years of development work of building it out from the ground up together to make that work. So had I not come into that, it would have been even more complex than it is. But yes, your initial reaction, I think, if you're coming into Eloqua from one of the more, I'd say, modern interfaces that's out there. I mean, controversial again if I say that, but honestly, it looks better. It reacts better. It has more of that design element. You're going to come up against a wall of I just set this program, but now where did it go? Or shoot, I have to check in this rule set to get this specific piece of code updated and keep that open and over here while I go into this other area. So I guess wrapping your head around that enterprise mapping takes a little while to get used to. So I think what that lent itself to was documentation and communication. So that was a big source of improvement is being able to document that out, understand where things are going and why, so that when you're now able to think about how we make decisions, bring in for example, another brand into your instance that has a whole different way of thinking. Now you're kind of armed with that process documentation to really seek out some consistency with your sales ops team and marketing team and sales of, okay, well, your training is going to cover this, this, and this. We're going to try to weave together this new group's processes in the same way as best as we can. So we have to structure our data architecture differently or add more columns to accommodate processing the best way. So at first, the opportunity was to improve on that documentation, but then it pays off once you've got your processes set. You've communicated this, teams are on board. You can really start using the benefits of Eloqua to its fullest potential, I think. So,
Great. Yeah, documentation seems to be that art that everybody really wants to do well, and the discipline is the part that you really have to put into it.
yeah, I mean, it's easy to say. I guess the the tip would be is just yes, document, but don't just document that a process is running. Literally open up that process, document what to expect in each component of that process so that whenever anything goes wrong or something, you're not having to go back and try to understand, okay, great, it's going into this thing named XYZ, but you don't know what is actually in XYZ or have a log of what might have changed since the last time that documentation was created. So tying into, if you have an enterprise system, you probably have a Jira system or something similar. Keeping those tasks and updates aligned with your documentation is also crucial because you're developing and you have your revisions and you want to keep that um, living record current.
Right. Speaking of brands, I know Brady operates multiple brands, but you keep them independent. How does that model work for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know he's on another one of these office hours session. You guys were talking about subscription models, and I had a bunch of questions of just some of the other people who are using just other subscription models. So we all have things we can learn from each other, right? But our way of the federated brand structure, if you kind of call it that more or less. There are a couple components that are unique that, are Eloqua features. So that's what I'll try to touch on is, how few of Eloqua, and you're thinking of having, multiple brands that kind of exist together. They're under the same umbrella, but this federated brand idea means that some of these people who always are loyal to one sub brand, they might not be aware of the five other sub brands. They never purchase through them, they never work with them, etc. So in that kind of scenario, you don't have a subscription model necessarily. You can't just go and say, or subscription preferences page rather. You can't just go and set up what are your preferences for email? Because a lot of those preferences aren't even known by one brand to the other or even elsewhere around the region. And then, Eloqua, if you structure it and architect this well, like we recently went through just last year, some even further brand changes, which were quite large. And that documentation played a key role in that, but it could be powerful to use. So, when we had to migrate other brands and when we continue to, one of the things that was of value to us was Eloqua's capability to set up different IP addresses per different brand, as long as you met the thresholds for volume, send volume, and to make it, you know, realistic for them. And, not only that, but a lot of, brands, if you think of companies, you're going to have your transactional emails, your day-to-day, sales engine that's happening, and you're going to have your marketing sometimes. So you really have to document out for each of your brands or groups, how much volume are you going to have? If you meet that threshold, then, having a transactional IP address really helps to get into warming strategies. You have a static IP that you're gradually warming. You can increase the volume, all of that, and then you can separate that. Sometimes I liked how that could work with having a transactional IP per brand because you can start with some of those transactional emails customers are going to love to get, like a quote they asked for or a receipt to a purchase. So it kind of helps in the transition. But to get into like how, if you're thinking of this, how might that work? Um, Once you set up these kind of multi-brand, Eloqua will work with you. You'll have to kind of go through the application process. But then it allows you to have special send profiles for each brand that sit in your email. So when you send, your email is coming, with a whole set of defaults that can be set for each brand. Having, those marketing IP addresses broken out too, it's nice to have the different sending subdomains to make that distinction. And then just align all of your forms and, image URLs, all that to that brand. One thing that Eloqua did introduce recently that we're able to take advantage of is the auto SSL cert. And that really makes it a lot easier because if you want to add in subdomains and you know, you have to maintain those. So it's less back and forth with our IT team to try to manage those manually. So I do like that. Things come up for renewal, you'll see it and it's taken care of. So that's a pro that I really enjoyed being to have. So anyway, so now you got these multiple brands. One, you're working in the same instance. So, a lot of problems sometimes will happen if you go back to Marketo versus Eloqua. If you have different instances, it's hard to see, or pull over what was in one over to another. Versus here, if they're sitting side by side, all of your users can see if you want them to see and leverage some resources from one or the other. Email groups with Eloqua becomes an interesting feature because now you're not as much beholden to that global subscribe as much as you are your individual email groups. So Eloqua having that email group memory is an essential component of this kind of strategy. So you could separate by brand, maybe you have survey people who always get surveys in that brand. People get campaign emails. I don't know. People get the newsletter by brand. So each brand has its own email group, and they can unsub and sub from those independently. Is nice, which kind of boots your global and subscribe to only the rarer cases when you need to use that. But we also still support the traditional preferences page for other brands. So, just documentation is important. Um, because any change you want to do on a field or something, it's kind of a strategy. We have to make sure it aligns with every other brand. So we're not introducing change that's going to break a system, rule set or something like that. So if you're going to go down this path, I think just strong data architecture alignment to make sure that you have some backing of, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, can I trace this purchase or this person to what brand? That's going to be important. But also, I think less reliance on one or two campaign, influence attributes like we see all the time when teams are in Salesforce. They always want to go after, well, did my campaign have a opportunity? You kind of have to get rid of that mindset and think more, holistically of, well, we need to leverage a wider approach to this data. It's possible for one email to have 6 rows and, work with your outside team to kind of think about how we're going to do campaign tracking. So to do this, you have to be ready to kind of abandon some of the easier routes of attribution for your team. And I think, these are just some tips for, kind of a federal data model. Leverage as much as you can, one-to-many form, or many to one, rather. I said that the wrong way, but you're going to have multiple sites whenever possible. This relies upon bringing them into a consistent form data. I think for us, it's a mindset of activities being fluid. So if anytime somebody does something, what are they doing at that point in time? And how are we going to take it at that point in time? And it's less of I think sometimes in smaller orgs, you get stuck in this kind of concept of one person gets one field stamp, or a person gets owned by an MQL system, and that just doesn't work when you're in a potential system of multiple brand influences. You could have somebody growing their brand awareness, possibly even so. Set up your way that you work with sales in such a way that, sales and yourself are never like owning a record, but they'll work with it if it comes across the team's direction and they know the process. So that's essential to being able to do it this way. We talked about training, documentation, but the other components too are Eloqua can trigger off of certain fields. So decide with your global team what those couple fields are going to be, and how critical are they going to be to your processing. For us, it's very important because knowing the country is a huge factor for how we process somebody's data, what activities will kick off after that, and we take advantage of contact level security, which is another cool feature that Eloqua lets you set up so that your users in, I'm just going to pick on a random country, Australia versus your users in Mexico, they don't, in Eloqua, they're just going to be sending email and working only with the Australia contacts. They're not going to see or have a risk of interacting or data processing on anyone in Mexico because your contact level security is tied to some of those triggers. So I think just working together, being able to data trigger on fields and taking advantage of your one-to-many forms, especially using the or many-to-one form strategy, especially using the API capabilities of Eloqua to receive data in is a huge benefit, especially in that last point because you're not tied to a CMS system, which is going to vary by so often. Ultimately, can form post data into one consistent location that aligns well with the process documentation so we know what we're doing with that data once it comes. So those are a couple points. Tried to kind of bring in some, Eloqua specific features of how that can be supported and how you can work in that environment of data. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
That great. I really appreciate the level of detail you went into this because I know the question on my side was pretty short, but you definitely addressed many aspects. We do have a question from the audience that I want to take at this time. This is from Lee, and she's circling back on your comment about documentation, and she says, I'd love to hear how people are managing documentation for things that frequently change. Documents are static while our tools are always changing. What's the process, governance, etc. Basically, how do you actualize all that?
Yeah, I think shared URLs are important. So if you're in a system with Google Drive, take advantage of or something similar. Don't ever link to a document that's going to change its link to a document that will stay the same link, and then change the data in it as essential. I know that sounds simple, but it's a little more complex to actually implement, especially if you're coming into documentation that was set up in a older way of maybe putting things on a shared drive, a physical drive or something. Beyond that, though, I think the ticket management system that you pick or use, being able to incorporate shared views from that ticket management system into your maybe your team page or another type of tool that you share with your management or something so they can see your tickets progressing, the data change, sprint, if you work in sprints, you can relay kind of an overview of what was completed. Really, a lot of the tools that we're kind of being asked to use and work in can work to our benefit because we can tie in tickets and into the change log. And then if you manage your documentation on topic based, that allows you to pivot a lot easier. Because now you have your shared document for a topic of, I don't know, you're working with an outside resource or something, and you can always just add in those Jira tickets or change requests underneath, and then just summarize if needed all the detail in them. So it kind of uses my collective memory sometimes of what changed.
Great. Yeah, I know as someone who's managed a team myself, uh, for the management side, it's more about the reminding them, did you update the documentation? Do you have the change notes for that? Almost like a development team, because you really are developing your
Yep.
marketing systems. And keeping that knowledge and history up to date is essential. I'm going to jump topics here because we are running a little over our normal time, which is fine. But I wanted to cover on two more topics if we could. Um, One of them is clay, and if you could briefly tell us about how you're using clay and why you chose
Sure.
clay, and then I'll go on to my last question.
Sure. We're using it selectively for certain things, but one area I do like is, especially if we talk in terms of Eloqua, is the times when you need to go outside of the box, outside of where your data is, and maybe enrich contact data that you otherwise don't have. It's useful because Clay acts as a clearinghouse with many different operations. So depending on your operation or need, just being able to have access to the tool gives you some flexibility because then you can bump around on different processes based on what you're trying to accomplish, and you're paying per the activation of your overall operation in Clay. I do like how the form it does accept the back and forth between Eloqua in Clay. If we get to my nice to haves, I wish Eloqua's webhook canvas connector would improve. But yeah.
You and many others. Yeah. Okay. Just a reminder, everyone, if you do have a question you'd like us to get in before we finish in a little bit, make sure you get those in now. My last question, I know that you are using a few cloud apps you went through that we developed. If you could just talk briefly about the kinds of problems and solutions that they have been able to help you solve in your system.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good thing about Eloqua is being able to try to take advantage of connectors and different types of connections wherever possible. So whether or not that's calling out to larger databases, or going in between your ABM tool, or back and forth, or Clay, but also being able to bolt on some tools and experiment with the help that provides on the canvas is certainly helpful. So we're experimenting and using some of the tools Forethought offers, especially when we look at our custom objects, because you're a large company, you accumulate a lot of data in those custom objects that need to be maintained. So where Eloqua might have built tools that are contact-based natively, their development might be a little behind on some of the custom object management. So being able to look at records that are about to expire, for the the different trigger, we can use the custom object tools to bring data into a canvas, extrapolate some of that data from that record before we delete it. I mean, that's kind of a instrumental piece of keeping our data records, under where we need to.
Great. Was there a question that I didn't ask today that you'd like to make sure that you get across to our folks today? Something you feel is important?
No, I mean, I think it's just keep asking questions, and if you're curious of anything else or want to reach out, you can find me on LinkedIn. If anyone's in the Milwaukee area and wants to work with our team, take a look. We might have some openings, so be happy to you know uh, talk with you on LinkedIn or something if anyone has more questions.
One last question, and then we'll go directly to Sebastian. We'll skip to the special offer. So, what was one thing you wish somebody had told you when you got started in your career?
Um, that's a stuffer. Well, thanks. So I guess you're more of a developer than you think. Don't let somebody tell you otherwise.
Great advice. Great advice. All right. Well, thank you very much, Matt. We really appreciate your comments here. A reminder to everyone that he's on LinkedIn. So if you'd like to establish a relationship, please feel free to do so. So, Sebastian, back to you.
Very good. This was a great conversation between the two of you. Thanks, Matt. Okay, as a reminder, if you have any last questions, please use the Q&A option, and I'll pause briefly to see if there are any additional questions. Okay, seems that's all the questions we have for today. But before you go, as a special thank you for attending live today,